of the trip he was troubled with a dry, hacking cough, especially irritable in smoke of camp or under stress of undue exertion. On the 30-mile river he found much open water, spanned by precarious ice bridges and fringed with narrow rim ice, tricky and uncertain. The rim ice was impossible to reckon on, and he dared it without reckoning, falling back on his revolver when his drivers demurred. But on the ice bridges, covered with snow though they were, precautions could be taken. These they crossed on their snowshoes, with long poles held crosswise in their hands, to which to cling in case of accident. Once over, the dogs were called to follow, and on such a bridge, where the absence of the center ice was masked by the snow, one of the Indians met his end. He went through as quickly and neatly as a knife through thin cream, and the current swept him from view down into the stream ice. That night his mate fled away through the pale moonlight. Rasmunsen futilely punctuated the silence with his revolver, a thing that he handled with more celerity than cleverness. 36 hours later the Indian made a police camp on the Big Salmon. Funny mans. What you call? Top head all loose," the interpreter explained to the puzzled captain. "Eh? Yep, clazy. Much clazy mans. Eggs, all the time eggs. Savvy? Come Bimeby." It was several days before Rasmunsen arrived, the 3 sleds lashed together and all the dogs in a single team. It was awkward, and where the going was bad he was compelled to back trip it sled by sled, though he managed most of the time, through Herculean efforts to bring all along on the one haul. He did not seem moved when the captain of the police told him his man was hitting the high places for Dawson, and was by that time probably halfway between Selkirk and Stewart. Nor did he appear interested when informed that the police had broken the trail as far as Pelly, for he had attained to a fatalistic acceptance of all natural dispensations, good or ill. But when they told him that Dawson was in the bitter clutch of famine, he smiled, threw the harness on his dogs, and pulled out. But it was at his next halt that the mystery of the smoke was explained. With the word at Big Salmon that the trail was broken to Pelly, there was no longer any need for the smoke wreath to linger in his wake, and Rasmunsen, crouching over lonely fire, saw a motley string of sleds go by. First came the courier and the half breed who had hauled him out from Bennett, then mail carriers for Circle City, 2 sleds of them, and a mixed following of ingoing Klondikers. Dogs and men were fresh and fat, while Rasmunsen and his brutes were jaded and worn down to the skin and bone. They of the smoke wreath had traveled one day in 3, resting and reserving their strength for the dash to come when broken trail was met with, while each day he had plunged and floundered forward, breaking the spirit of his dogs and robbing them of their mettle. As for himself, he was unbreakable. They thanked him kindly for his efforts on their behalf, those fat, fresh men, thanked him kindly with broad grins and ribald laughter. And now, when he understood, he made no answer, nor did he cherish silent bitterness. It was immaterial. The idea, the fact behind the idea, was not changed. Here he was, and his thousand dozen. There was Dawson. The problem was unaltered. At the Little Salmon, being short of dog food, the dogs got into his grub, and from there to Selkirk he lived on beans, coarse brown beans, big beans, grossly nutritive, which gripped his stomach and doubled him up at 2-hour intervals. But the factor at Selkirk had a notice on the door of the post to the effect that no steamer had been up the Yukon for 2 years, and in consequence grub was beyond price. He offered to swap flour, however, at the rate of a cupful of each egg, but Rasmunsen shook his head and hit the trail. Below the post he managed to buy frozen horsehide for the dogs, the horses having been slain by the Chilkat cattlemen, and the scraps and offal preserved by the Indians. He tackled the hide himself, but the hair worked into the bean sores of his mouth and was beyond endurance. Here at Selkirk he met the forerunners of the hungry exodus of Dawson, and from there on they crept over the trail, a dismal throng. "No grub," was the song they sang. "No grub, and had to go. Everybody holding candles for a rise in the spring. Flour, $1.50 a pound, and no sellers." "Eggs?" one of them answered. "$1 apiece, but there ain't none." Rasmunsen made a rapid calculation. $12,000, he said aloud. "Hey?" the man asked. "Nothing," he answered, and mushed the dogs along. When he arrived at Stewart River, 70 from Dawson, 5 of his dogs were gone, and the remainder were falling in the traces. He also was in the traces, hauling with what little strength was left in him. Even then he was barely crawling along 10 miles a day. His cheekbones and nose, frostbitten again and again, were turning bloody black and hideous. The thumb, which was separated from the fingers by the gee-pole, had likewise been nipped, and gave him great pain. The monstrous moccasins still encased his foot, and strange pains were beginning to rack the leg. At 60 Mile the last beans, which he had been rationing for some time, were finished, yet he steadfastly refused to touch the eggs. He could not reconcile his mind to the legitimacy of it, and staggered and fell along the way to Indian River. Here a fresh killed moose and an open-handed old timer gave him and his dogs new strength, and at Ainsley's he felt repaid for it when a stampede, right from Dawson in 5 hours, was sure he'd get $1.25 for every egg he possessed. He came up the steep bank by the Dawson barracks with fluttering heart and shaking knees. The dogs were so weak that he was forced to rest them, and waiting he leaned limply against the gee-pole. A man, an eminently decorous-looking man, came sauntering by in a great bearskin coat. He glanced at Rasmunsen curiously, then stopped and ran a speculative eye over the dogs and the 3 lashed sleds. "What you got?" he asked. "Eggs," Rasmunsen answered huskily, hardly able to pitch his voice above a whisper. "Eggs? Whoopee! Whoopee!" He sprang up into the air, gyrated madly, and finished with half a dozen war steps. "You don't say! All of 'em?" "All of 'em." "So you must be the egg man." He walked around and viewed Rasmunsen from the other side. "Come now, ain't you the egg man?" Rasmunsen didn't know, but supposed he was, and the man sobered down a bit. "What do you expect to get for 'em?" he asked cautiously. Rasmunsen became audacious. "$1.50," he said. "Done!" the man came back promptly. "Give me a dozen." I mean $1.50 apiece," Rasmunsen hesitatingly explained. "Sure, I heard you. Make it 2 dozen. Here's the dust." The man pulled out a healthy gold sack, the size of a small sausage, and knocked it negligently against the gee-pole. Rasmunsen felt a strange trembling in the pit of his stomach, a tickling of the nostrils, and an almost overwhelming desire to sit down and cry. But a curious, wide-eyed crowd was beginning to collect, and man after man was calling out for eggs. He was without scales, but the man with the bearskin coat fetched a pair and obligingly weighed in the dust while Rasmunsen passed out the goods. Soon there was a pushing and shoving and shouldering and a great clamor. Everybody wanted to buy and to be served first, and as the excitement grew Rasmunsen cooled down. This would never do. There must be something behind the fact of their buying so eagerly. It would be wiser if he rested first and sized up the market. Perhaps eggs were worth $2 apiece. Anyway, whenever he wished to sell, he was sure of $1.50. "Stop!" he cried, when a couple of hundred had been sold. "No more now. I'm played out. I've got to get a cabin, and then you can come and see me.